remember that following the brutal rape and murder of University of Cape Town student Uyinene Mrwetyana in 2019, who was killed by a 42-year-old post office worker, a coalition of around 70 civil society activist groups under the hashtag Sandton shutdown gathered in Sandton 2 years ago to demand 2% from companies listed on the JSE. Protesters demanded money from corporate South Africa to help fund initiatives aimed at stopping GBV. It's almost 2 years later. Have corporations honored their commitment? Well, to answer that, we're joined by Keitumetse, Moutloatse, Chairperson of the Womxn Caucus. Keitumetse, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. You made a call for private sector to help fight gender-based violence. And if I recall correctly, the JSE CEO also came out to say, yes, we hear you, and your demands do not fall on deaf ears. What's happened since then?
Thank you so much, and thank you to all your viewers. I think over the past 2 years, there has been a lot of improvements in terms of some of the demands that we've made. You know, the general demand, which was to fund the fight, we saw that we've seen the establishment of the GBV Response 1 Fund, which is a private sector-led fund, which is one of the demands that we had made to the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, really saying that we want to see private sector businesses putting their money where their mouths are. And I'm happy to say that 2 years later, we have an established GBV fund, but there are also some underlying demands that still need strengthening, which we're hoping we'll be able to tackle in tomorrow's commemorative dialogue.
And let's touch base on some of the achievements and the milestones that have been made since 2019. Of course, we cannot ignore the fact that we keep hearing of these gruesome horrors. Just last week in the Eastern Cape, a young woman was laid to rest. She died at the hands of her boyfriend. What are these strides that have been made in the past 2 years or so?
Yeah, interesting. I mean, it's when we reflect, 2 years ago we had marched, really in response to Uyinene, and 2 years later we have similar cases, similar incidences. So I must be honest, and I'm very critical to say that although we have seen some institutional advancements in terms of the adoption of the National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence and the establishment of the GBV Fund, we are still seeing a massive gap in terms of the services and interventions being implemented and being able to tackle the daily scourge of gender-based violence and femicide. But I think even in the midst of mounting violence in our communities, we must be able to be critical and reflect on things that have gone right. I know to date the GBV Response Fund has been able to mobilize 128 million rand across private sector. We still believe it's not enough. We still believe that those numbers can be tripled before the end of the year, but it is a good start. And I think this also becomes pivotal because this year we also celebrate 1 year since the adoption of the National Strategic Plan. Recently, we've sat down as civil society organizations as well as government to reflect on some of the achievements over the past year in terms of implementing the National Strategic Plan. But I think what we all can agree is that our interventions, our approaches are still very much happening in isolation. We need to be able to strengthen partnerships across sectors. And this is why we have tomorrow's dialogue, to really push for different stakeholders who believe in the same mandate of a violence-free South Africa, or to come together to think about how do we find some of the solutions to a mounting crisis we see in our communities.
As you speak about solutions, the violence, the horrors, the brutality, it's something that's still ongoing. I refer to a funeral that took place in the Eastern Cape, a woman chopped up in a suitcase in the most gruesome of manners. What is your reaction as you continue to see these atrocities? I mean, you speak about a good start, but we do have a long way to go when we reflect and monitor the day-to-day events when it comes to gender-based violence.
I think, cases like Nozcelo and many other women and children and queer people who've lost their lives to intimate partner violence is a reminder for the need for this work to continue, right? And I think it's very important for us to note that the call for private sector to fund the fight does not happen in isolation, right? This is on the backs of feminist movement organizing, dating as far back as, you know, the Kwesi case, student activism in institutions of higher learning, the total shutdown. So all these are culminations of the need for us to intensify, you know, our fight against gender-based violence and femicide. But what these cases also reveal to us is that gone are the days of talk shops. We need to be able to implement and localize the interventions proposed in the National Strategic Plan. And we know that localizing interventions means we need the money. And this is why it is it's really important and it's critical for private sector to come on board. But I think it's also important to note to our viewers that this year we saw the launch of the Generation Equality Forum in both France and Mexico. South Africa at a global level is the co-lead on economic justice and rights for women. And I think, you know, us having conversations with private sector and businesses also feeds into the discourse around the gender pay gap, feeds into the discourse in terms that we have only 13% of women in executive positions on JC listed companies. Yeah. So we must be able to take a multi-pronged and cross-sectoral approach when dealing with gender-based violence.
Absolutely. Keitumetse, I'm going to have to cut you short, unfortunately. Thank you so much for your time.